think that that little movie really sets the stage in terms of showing to all of us that Africa is very much on the global radar. It is attracting a lot of investments. It's clearly a continent on the move, and yet there is a lot more that we need to do as we move forward. With that, I would now like to introduce our distinguished panel. Let me start on my left with President Mbeki, President of South Africa. He certainly is a great leader, a visionary, and somebody that we all look up to.
If you asked the Minister of Finance who's sitting behind me of South Africa, he would say I look prettier from the back than from the front.
He says, I think we're all used to following you, so we see your back more than we see the front. Then we have Dr. Ibrahim, who's the chairman Celtel International, and also the chairman of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. There's Professor Spence, the Nobel laureate, and Professor Emeritus, Stanford University, and Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, Distinguished Fellow, Brookings Institute, Washington, USA, and a former finance minister of Nigeria. And on my right is Mr. Haiko Alfeld, Director and Head Africa, World Economic Forum. The theme for the last 2.5 days has been raising the bar. And really, to sum up what we've all been talking and engaging over the last 2.5 days is in today's session, which is Unleashing Opportunity, a Blueprint for Africa's Growth. And let me therefore start the whole discussion with Professor Spence. And really from some of the comments that you made yesterday and which have been widely talked about in today's newspapers, in terms of this whole focus on growth. And while Africa has grown at 5% consistently over the last few years, you did comment that a 9% growth is certainly feasible. But at the same point in time, the issue then becomes of sustainability, which is more important. And even a 5%, 6%, to sustain that is a challenge in terms of resources, in terms of the ability of the continent to keep continuously delivering on that. So where do you see Africa today? And how do you see this whole growth evolving over the next few years? And what are some of the challenges that need to be addressed as Africa continues on the growth journey?
Well, it's wonderful to be here and to sense the progress and the forward momentum and sense of optimism. And there's no question that there's been enormous achievements in the macroeconomic environment is stable, investment environment's better. I think everybody in this room understands that the next transition that everyone wants to make is to long-run sustained growth that generates a very large amount of employment and therefore makes a major inroad into poverty. And that is something that's still a work in progress. In order to do that, there are many challenges, and I'm sure we'll talk about them today. One is that the level of public sector investment in most places has to go up, because that is what increases the rate of return to the private sector investment that generates the jobs. In the case of Africa, that surely has to be, in part, a regional effort, a kind of connectivity so that it makes sense. And that's important not only because the domestic market is important when properly integrated because it's large, but it's also required for most of these countries to connect properly with the global environment, and that is essential, as we've learned, for sustained high growth. So there are many challenges, but I think people in this room are pretty optimistic.
Can I turn to you? in terms of what do you see as some of the key areas where the public sector needs to make investments, like Professor Spence was saying, and which are some of the areas where the public sector needs to move away from and let private enterprise drive growth?
Well, I think I'd like to begin by also echoing the sense of optimism that is in the air. So despite all the problems and challenges we continue to see, as I interact with people from different parts of the business community, there seems to be a renewed interest on the continent because we've got that platform there. And so the issue now is, how do we move from this macroeconomic stability, as Michael was saying, to micro and sectoral issues? How do we have the kind of growth that is really going to benefit our people? Because as we mentioned in a session, we are growing, but people still feel this sense of dissatisfaction. And I think that we need to look at 2 or 3 things. First of all, you mentioned what should the public sector be doing. I think the public sector in our countries needs to be doing, to continue on the path that is going now. Savings rate in the continent, savings to GDP, is about 20% compared to 50 in China, 38 elsewhere in East Asia. So we need to find a way to mobilize more resources from the public sector to invest in infrastructure, and regional infrastructure would help. It would help to connect the many small markets on the continent. We need to trade with each other more, even as we are trying to trade globally, and that will help. We need to reduce the barriers amongst each other. We need to work on our institutions, and here I want to mention one thing. There's a very nice sculpture at the corner of the room. There's an elephant in the room here. And there was a session called Taboos, in which I participated. You know, what are the taboos that keep us from going forward on this continent? And the biggest taboo that people came up with was the issue of corruption, that we talk a lot about it. So in a sense, is it a taboo? But we don't really do as much. So when we work on those issues, when we begin to inculcate in ourselves the strategies to deal with that, and build our institutions so that they are strong, this will also help, and it's a public sector thing. And finally, I think we need to have more partnerships between the public sector and the private that will minimize the risk. Private sector still perceives a degree of risk from investing on the continent. So what specific things can we do to mitigate that risk? How can we unleash more capital going into infrastructure itself within the continent?
Just talking about infrastructure, Dr. Ibrahim, clearly the telecommunication industry is something that has redefined a lot of the dynamics in India for us. And over the last decade, we've seen a very significant change in the way each of us live our lives and the way we engage. And clearly, since you come from that industry, do share with us what role has technology, has innovation played in telecommunications to maybe address some of these infrastructure issues across Africa, and more specifically in rural Africa.
Okay, that's really a long order. Maybe I'll speak about the first part now, second part maybe a little bit later, not to abuse my time slots. Really something wonderful happened in Africa. In about 10 years ago, the number of telephones in Africa were really incredibly low. And in some countries in Africa, the fixed operation did not exceed 2,000 or 3,000 lines. And that's for 20, 30, 40 million people. And half of this actually did not work. And that's after 100 years. Most of the PTTs, the postal and telegraph services in Africa, started almost at the beginning of the 20th century. Something wonderful happened in Africa. We were able really to leapfrog a whole generation of technology. And instead of updating the fixed lines and going from manual exchanges to digital exchanges to advanced services, etc., we leaped all that and went into the mobile technology, which was new, and went for GSM, which was the latest technology just coming out of Europe at that time. The picture today is really incredible. There is, by the end of this year, there will be 200 million telephones in Africa. That's for 900 million people. 200 million telephones have been installed here at no cost whatsoever for the governments. Actually, the governments collected a lot of money in licenses, in taxes, in all sort of levels there, and the services have been provided, which really changes the lives of people, connected so that was a wonderful example where really the private sector, when it was enabled, or the governments let us alone, we managed to go and do this investment here, and it was a win-win situation for everybody. And we hope that example can be repeated in other areas as well. Rural communications, and I'll speak about it maybe later on if you give me a chance.
Certainly. Mr. President, in terms of where Africa is today, I think, and the future for Africa, you, along with some of your colleagues in Africa, put together NEPAD. You set out a direction and a framework for Africa moving into the future and being engaged with the global economy as a global partner. So can you share with us, sir, how NEPAD is moving, and how do you see it evolving over the next few years?
Malvinder, can I answer a question you haven't asked?
Please.
You know, we have a topic here, as indeed you correctly indicated at the beginning, which in part says a blueprint for Africa's growth. Shouldn't we be saying a blueprint for Africa's growth? Because I think in reality, if you got to deal with the matter practically, you've got to disaggregate the continent. I think if you deal with it as this one big lump, it's something you can't chew. So rather, I would say this is the first thing we need to do, I think, is to say blueprints for Africa's growth. Because obviously, even from a country to, on a country-to-country basis, you have Libya, population of 6 million?
7 million.
7 million.
Lot of expats.
Huge volumes of oil. And South Africa, which is very different. And your challenges for growth, and you can even go region to region, from region to region. And you would see that the blueprints would have to vary. So I'm saying that that's the first thing I think we would need to look at. And perhaps this is an African challenge, Ngozi, and more. That we should do ourselves, this thing ourselves, to say, look, let's make a presentation about Africa that makes sense. And we're talking about a real challenge of growth in the way that Professor Spence has said, and other people have. But you can't expect people to respond to Africa. They may respond to West Africa or Southern Africa, or they may even respond to Nigeria. So I think that's the first thing. And that, in a sense, Malvinder, comes back to the NEPAD problem. NEPAD challenge. Indeed, as you say, there's a framework. We know where we need to go. Continent has defined this. We know what the principal tasks are. First problem that arose, well, not first, a problem that arose was we need the implementing agencies for NEPAD would be your regional economic communities. There's no need to duplicate structures or create new structures where structures already exist. So here are the regional economic communities, ECOWAS, SADC, and so on. These are our instruments. And you find just one problem, that even when you come to the point of saying, all right, we've generated all manner of commitments from people to address water. What's a regional plan? Can you do a business plan for this integrated regional development of water resources? As a result of which you would have a project, a marketable project, it's costed and so on. This is the amount of money we need. And then you find that the regional economic communities don't have the capacity to design projects. As a consequence of which we then agreed to set up a fund at the African Development Bank, just to build up this capacity in our regional economic communities to be able to do that. The ideas are there, the concepts are there, the implementing institutions don't exist. So that's what I mean by, you see, I think if we disaggregate the problem, then you'd zero in on the actual thing. You see, take this region here, Southern African Development Community. We decide as part of what is agreed by everybody, integration, let's trade among one another and so on. So we say, let's have a free trade area by whatever year. In the meantime, the South African economy, of course, is the biggest and it was kind of dominant. We will have an asymmetrical process with regard to the reduction of tariffs. And let South Africa move first and fastest with regard to that. And then indeed that's what's happened. But you then find that it doesn't change the trade patterns in the region at all. South Africa, despite that, remains this dominant trader in the region. The reason is because the capacity to produce things in the region to export to South Africa is not there. So let's come at the matter. Again, you'd have to come at it in a disaggregated fashion to say, if I was a medium-sized company, I would open a factory in Malawi. Cost of production are lower than here, I'm sure, and export to the South African market. But why are people not doing that? Maybe it's because we've told them about a blueprint for Africa. Why don't we tell them about a blueprint for growth here? And here are the specifics of it.
Because you don't know.
Because we're not telling them.
Exactly.
So now I'm saying that the challenge that's faced us with regards to the implementation of the NEPAD programs are these capacity problems that we're trying to deal with elsewhere. That's why you have that fund for capacity at the ADB. The infrastructure consortium, again based at the ADB, was to deal with this problem. The investment climate facility that came out of the Glen Eagles Summit is to deal with all of these problems in that kind of specific way. So I think with regard to that, it's thrown up this challenge of the weakness of the capacity of the institutions on our continent. That's a matter that we've got to address from region to region. And I'm sure it's happening, but of course the other element to this NEPAD process is a peer review mechanism, which is functioning and it's working. We probably need to speed it up a bit more. But it's working. This month, July, they are going to issue a critical peer review report on South Africa about the wrong things we're doing, which is fine. But it's moving.
Maybe I can build on something that His Excellency said, since you said we should have a free flow. And on the issue of disaggregation, I think we also need to disaggregate the way we approach problems. You know, for the issue of infrastructure, if we really want to build regional or even national infrastructure, we need to look at different approaches. If we say that we have capacity constraints, then maybe the best thing to do is, instead of trying to get our organizations to plan out the projects and try to come up with projects that can be implemented, we need to say, fine, we don't have the capacity. Let's have a least cost type of approach if we want to get water into 2 or 3 countries, or we want to build a pipeline, and something that, you know, if there are private sector capacities that can supply those, we can ask them to present us with proposals, bid out for who would implement it for us at least cost, because we need to deliver to some of our population who would not be able to pay. So governments have to come in. But you know, we can rank them and say, here is an organization that can supply water or build a pipeline at the least cost. We take it, they design, implement, and we pay. Because if we spend time trying to find those who would design it, it might delay. So I think unbundling, as His Excellency said, some of the problems, disaggregating them on what government should be doing could really be helpful. Because some of those problems government is trying to solve and has no capacity can be solved by our own African private sector in partnership with others.
So really what you're talking about is for the government to be a facilitator.
Exactly.
And to be an enabler and let the best parties involved make it happen in the most cost-effective way, which is going to be sustainable.
Exactly. And where the subsidies are needed, because it's not all goods that people can pay for, governments can come in and then, you know, help to provide those monies, rather than spend time trying to design things ourselves and come up with them, until such a time as we really build up the capacity to do that.
Just leading on from that, Professor Spence, you know, in terms of this whole public-private partnership model, I'm sure in your experience you would have seen a series of models which are scalable and are successful, which can then be replicated, be it in Africa or in other parts of the world. So can you share some of your thoughts of how one can address this issue?
Well, I think His Excellency made an excellent point about this, which is an important dimension of this is communication. Clarity about what the arrangements are. Patience, because information doesn't travel around the world instantly, notwithstanding the internet. And one has to be persistent and wait for investments that have the effect of being demonstration effects. The other thing is, and it's entirely consistent with what President Mbeki and Ngozi have said, and that is, we don't actually know how to do this. There is no roadmap that economists or anyone else can hand you. And so a great deal of the successful part of the process is experimentation. Let's try this. If it doesn't work, then we declare it an unsuccessful experiment. But I think in the area of public-private partnerships, what the private sector needs is stability and a reasonable set of terms that provide an adequate rate of return. And there are areas of infrastructure and other things where it's more natural, and others that are less. I don't think we want to take a tour of that right now.
Let me, if I may, just give an example of something that worries me personally. A typical project where partnership is needed and regional cooperation is needed. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Nile Basin, the Nile, 300 million people depend on that single source of water. 9 countries around it. And guess what? The next big war in Africa is going to be there, because all of them are running short of water. And each country, each of these countries are tinkering with the Nile its own little thing. This guy putting a dam here, this guy putting a power station here. That's not necessarily the most effective and optimum way to deal with that major resource. Why can't we have a regional cooperation here where people say, how can we make best use of that resource? How can we control it? How can we generate power? How we do that? And then we all share in it. That will be cost effective, and that turn those guys into partners instead of warring parties in 20 years or so. And that will going to be a very difficult situation if we don't start and plan for it now. We always wait until crisis happen, and then we try to go around to see how we're going to deal with the fires. Sometimes you need to think a little bit ahead And that's a typical project really waiting for solution.
Just talking about this issue on public-private partnership, clearly, I think from various countries in Africa, we are hearing that there is a clear intent and a desire to be willing to allow partners, private enterprises come in and work jointly and facilitate many of these key infrastructure projects. So is the private sector actually stepping up to the challenge to say, yes, we're interested, we'd be interested to come and partner and take over this project and really get it going across different countries? Is that happening?
We have a major problem, frankly, in the private sector. And that issue is raised in the communication for rural areas and otherwise. If you start to talk about partnership between private sector and public sector, we need to have a proper business model which is equitable to everybody and which is transparent. We are all aware that the issue of corruption is high on our agenda. And I don't want to get, as a private sector, get involved with a government project where either I have a bad deal and I go bankrupt, or I make money and I stand accused of being subsidized by public money. So how we draw the balance there? We need a right business model which is transparent and equitable. That, unfortunately, does not really exist at the moment, to my knowledge. We don't have something on the table which is workable, because we don't want to go into these muddy waters.
So you're saying,
everybody, the point that Professor Spence made was absolutely correct about these public-private partnerships. But we will come back again, Malvinder, to this problem of capacity. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, with regard to this thing. Here is a big city. It doesn't have enough money. Wants to get into partnership with a water provider. All of that, and a contract for the next 30 years. You put in infrastructure, you supply the water, it's regulated in terms of how much you charge and all that. Now, if you don't, as a public partner in this PPP, if you don't have the proper capacity to negotiate, to do the calculations and so on, you are going to end up with big problems. Because Ibrahim here wants to make maximum profit, quite naturally being Ibrahim. So, no being a business person. and will drive a hard bargain and probably brings more expertise, what Ngozi was saying. Is best able to hire your best lawyers and accountants and this, that, and the other, and you negotiate, and in the end, you find that you come out at the wrong end of this. So this is, apart from the business model more, part of the problem is on the government side. So we really have to look at that, the critically important PPPs. We need to be able to access these capital resources and skills and management technology and so on that's in private hands, and get into these partnerships. But we need to build the capacity to get into successful partnerships. If we don't, then the struggle, and I'm quite sure there must be quite a few examples around the continent of failure of this, because one of the partnership was too unequal. Mm-hmm.
But are there learnings across the continent that we can pick up from and maybe address that? Because I think experimentation is extremely critical. And yet there would be an evolution of learning, and some will go right on one side and some will go right on the other side. And eventually, through transparency, through public pressure, through the media, issues will get debated and discussed and put forth in front of the people.
Yeah. I think, first that it is true when we're dealing with the private sector on the continent. I mean, in my previous job, you saw that too, that there are asymmetries of information. They have a lot more of the capacity to do some of these things. But we can we do need to build the capacity to be able to negotiate with them. I believe that we can, because we also have resources of our own. We have some of our best trained people scattered all over the world who have this kind of skills. And we just need to figure out what incentives can we give to bring these people so that they can sit on the other side of the table to negotiate with the private sector, whilst we also train up the capacity at home. So that's one. The second thing is we've had some successes, and we need to study what has happened. I think Trevor was mentioning, has mentioned several times, in the SADC region, there's been some successful cooperation across the region in some projects. In ECOWAS, we just did, or are doing the West African gas pipeline, which took a lot of doing. But in the end, it's working. We'll go all the way from Nigeria to Senegal, we'll supply gas. We'll make it easier for all the countries along the route to be able to have their energy issues looked at. How did we do it? That one, we brought some of our multilateral agencies got involved. The World Bank and the ADB can be honest brokers in this process to make sure that, the private sector does not jip us whilst we are trying to get our own people across the table. So that can be one model. I'm not saying it's the only one. But as we are struggling, we can use that. Bring in these people. We are members. We own these institutions. Surely we can deploy them to work with us and help us negotiate these contracts. Now we've done the gas pipeline. We put the money on the table. And that's one good model. And we can find others that could inform some of these regional infrastructure projects that we need to do.
Just moving a little ahead in terms of the whole... Yeah, please.
Ngozi and Minister Manuel and I are members of a growth commission, as many of you know. And one of the first things the experienced leaders, of whom these are two important ones, said to each other is there's a tremendous potential for learning directly from each other as part of the process of growth and development. And I think we have to, Ngozi's talking about specific instances of that, and I think there's a great willingness around the world to share experience at very high levels of leadership.
Let me just move a little ahead in terms of, I think for Africa, it's extremely critical for African success to have the middle class emerging and becoming stronger, and that too faster. And also for small and medium-sized enterprise to flourish. So how do you see that actually happening in Africa today? And what does the continent need to do to encourage more of this?
Well, I mean, in some sense, nobody knows the answer to that until it's happened. I think what you do is you create an environment in which barriers are removed. The negative part of reform is important. You try to ensure the costs of capital are low. You invest in education and infrastructure to raise the rates of return. But if I sat here and tried to guess what fraction of the growth in South Africa will come from the domestic economy and what fraction will come from labor-intensive activity, goods or services for the global economy, I'd be guessing. I think we should understand that both of those growth drivers are important and pay attention to them. And specifically in the global economy, there's an informational asymmetry. Small and medium-sized businesses do not understand without help the global marketplace that they might serve. And that's well worth attention on the part of business organizations as well as government. But in the end, I think these decisions are driven by the private sector, with the public sector providing the supportive environment.
Mr. President, let me just carrying on this point about reducing barriers and increasing the flow of trade. While Africa is got multiple countries and multiple systems and regional cooperations, but in one way the strength of Africa is its vast population of close to 800 million people. So is there a way that we can break down the barriers and have a free flow of economic trade and activity across the continent, which will enable people to engage in business, which will enable a lot more market access and therefore bring in investments, bring in competition, and have better products and services being available at more competitive terms. How should one address something like this?
Well, first of all, Malvinder, I would say that what you've just said is what the entire leadership on the African continent would say. Everybody recognizes this. It's necessary to break down these barriers. It's necessary to increase trade among ourselves and all of that. So it's, I think, from the point of view of understanding the critical importance of that and the numbers, size of markets and so on, I don't think there's a problem of understanding about that on the continent and acceptance of this. You have, there is quite a hard push now for some people, from some people, around this notion of a United States of Africa, an African government, an all-African government, and so on, in good measure driven by these considerations. That if you don't intervene in that way to break down these barriers that isolate us into small little countries and all that, then you're not going to get movement. So I'm saying that there's general recognition of that. Now, how do we do it? I think that will also be the point that, again, Ngozi made earlier. I think the only logical way to do it, the only practical way to do it is indeed on this regional basis. With the West Africans and the Southern Africans and Central Africans, East Africans, North Africans, and so on, to say, we actually do have these institutions already, these regional economic communities. Let's move in the way that you are indicating. Well, I tried to give you an example of what happened here in SADC. Because a decision has been taken, we implement. But is it producing the results that we expected? But I'm saying that I think the only logical way to do it is via these regional economic communities. Let's go for these free trade areas and all that. Plus the matter also that has been properly recognized in our discussions here, which is this regional infrastructure challenge. To be able to move people and goods and so on across all of these political boundaries, it is a matter that needs to be attended to. I think all of that, generally on the continent, would all of us agree about all of that. But as I say, the challenge arises in the doing of all of these things. But I think the perspective is correct. It's all of this, for instance, is very much part of the NEPAD program, accepted everywhere. But then you've got to get down to the brass tacks of it, in terms of what is not happening. The Kenyans here, I don't know if there's any Kenyan, they've been complaining for many years about high South African tariffs against Kenyan tea. I don't know if we brought them down, but those are the practical problems. We have a problem where an issue that arose here about clothing and textiles in the region, in the context of this free trade thing, and came reports, allegations, or whatever, of some of the goods coming from elsewhere in the world entering, and all that was happening was just attachment of labels. Made in country so and so in the region, when in fact the thing came ready-made suit from somewhere. And those have become the challenges of the implementation of this vision. But the vision is there, and I think the steps that need to be taken are accepted generally, and really it's just a matter of doing what we need to do.
So just, Dr. Ibrahim, and this whole issue on regional cooperation, a greater amount of trade within neighboring countries, as a businessman, How do some of these other countries, say around South Africa, why are they not attracting the kind of investments when there is, a lowering of tariff barriers, import duties, and then those products could then come into Africa, into South Africa, being produced in neighboring countries? What are some of the issues in your mind that you see there?
Right. I think we have a number of issues, really. I'll start with the issue of, of image. Africa's image to the outside world, unfortunately, is not that helpful. I believe, yes, we have problems in Africa, but we getting really a worse picture than what is in the ground, actually. So we have an image problem. And in a way, media always report problems. Of course, by its nature, the world news. And you ask any European, Africa, they immediately think of two things: Zimbabwe and Darfur. Now, there are 53 countries in Africa. That's two. What about the 51 countries? But that is what the media is bombing out. And rightly, I'm not saying that media should not put these stories out, but that creates that sort of perception. There are few seconds, the few minutes available for us on the international TV channels, etc. So once they finish these two stories, there's no time for us. Then we move on to other stories. So we have an image problem. That is not helpful. We are fighting that, all of us. I mean, everywhere I go and I speak every week, somewhere in Europe or the United States, say actually we managed to go and do business in Africa. We did not pay bribes, and we managed to do decent business. We made a lot of profits for our shareholders, and that's including South African Development Bank also. We made some good money with us. So it's not only me, only the guy who makes the money. I mean, you guys making money too. So we say, no, that's it's business. It's just like any other place. But we can really have higher return here. So there is an image problem. Of course, we also need to improve the environment for doing business in Africa. And we welcome the initiative of the Green Eagle to introduce that new body, which really helping to work. And there was a presentation here about how we try to help the business environment. There's so much red tape, so much. You try to take something through customs. You're trying to just registering a company, starting a business. So that's why a lot of people don't even bother registering companies. They start trading without forming companies. So there's a number of really issues with you. I give you a small example. We came with the concept of one network for Africa. We're trying to crush the borders between Africa. We said anybody working in our networks can, when cross, go to another country, there's no roaming charges. This is something, by the way, Europe, they have a big issue about roaming charges. We said there's no roaming charges. Carry your number and go. We thought that's a great thing to help. You don't believe it. It is the government. So he says, no. We cannot allow you. Why? And that's exactly what's the problem. Why don't make life cheaper, easier for your... it is sovereignty, it is bureaucracy, it is lack of understanding. There is this sort of issues, really, I think, which doesn't help. So sometimes we shoot ourselves in the foot as well. I'm glad to say at least 6 countries saw the light and allowed us to do it, and we hope the rest will come. But this is the kind of things we face as business people in Africa.
Well, I just, Mr. President, we have a lot of key opinion leaders and decision makers in this room today. And I'm sure they'd like to know from you, what are some of the things that are in your mind? So maybe if you could share with them some of the key thoughts and priorities that you have, in addition to what you've spoken about. And the second thing, what I would like to do is, before we allow the audience to ask the panel questions, maybe let's have you ask the audience 1 or 2 questions.
Well, to answer both questions with one answer. In fact, what was in my mind was precisely these important people in the room. Because indeed I thought that we'd spoken enough, but what do they think? I mean, I'm not an investor, but I'm speaking as though I know what it is that needs to be done in order to attract the investor. But in fact, I don't know. I may pretend to know. So that it'd be very interesting to hear what they say. You see, I mean, even about the process here over the last 2.5 days, 3 days, because there will be another conference next year. Is it properly designed? I mean, it's for somebody who's really interested in these matters of investment in Africa, doing trade with Africa, doing whatever. Are we structuring the discussion properly in a way that makes sense to them? So that was what was in my mind, was what do they think? So before I give my bright ideas about the vision and all that, let's hear what they have to say.
Anybody in the audience that would like to answer that?
Thank you. A comment and a question.
Can you just...
A comment and a question. Julie Gishuru, NTV, Nation Media Group, Kenya. The comment is just in response to what Ibrahim was saying about coverage of the continent. We do recognize that we do cover a lot of negative news. We may create perceptions that, are not very positive. But in some places, you find that where institutions have failed, people end up coming to the media. And you end up having to tackle some of those stories just to push the fact that there have been failures and to create change. So in a way, some of it is positive. To the issue now of what earlier President Thabo Mbeki had mentioned about needing perhaps to have several different blueprints for Africa. I'd just like to know and really challenge the governments, how would we then remove the barriers? How do we harmonize if we have many different blueprints? I'm just a bit confused.
No, you shouldn't be confused. You know what I'm saying? You see, we take Kenya. Kenya is part of the East African region, belongs to COMESA. COMESA has developed in a way that's different from the way that SADC has evolved. So I'm saying when we're talking about the African continent, we should say what's happening in the COMESA region. And what is it that needs to happen tomorrow? What possibilities does it create, and so on? Because it's different from what's happening in the SADC region. That's the different blueprints. And and really, it's very important. Now, it's again this question. I'm coming back to this question I was asking of investors. What is it that they think with regard to these challenges we face of this African growth? The things that need to happen, even with regard to organizing of conferences like this. What is it that we need to do which make them act as one of the partners in this growth process?
I think let me just share my perspective as an investor and on behalf of Ranbaxy that has been in Africa since 1978. We were the first Indian pharmaceutical company to set a foot on Africa, and we've been here since that time. And today we have a direct and indirect presence in 44 of the 53 African markets. We have manufacturing in South Africa, in Nigeria, and in Egypt. I think one of the things that we face in the pharmaceutical industry is that every country has different regulations, has different requirements for the same product, and therefore you need to develop and manufacture different batches, different specs for the same product for different markets. Now, the regulations in many of these countries change every year, so there is no stability in the policy and also in the regulatory framework that is not consistent. And therefore, it's not economically viable for us to produce batches of medicines, and then, because the requirement in some of these countries is so small that one batch could last you for over a year. But when the regulations change, that has to get written off. And therefore, if there is a greater harmonization in the policies, and because the product is really the same, and if the product is acceptable to South Africa, and if that can be used in other parts of Africa, then you can produce one lot, one batch, multiple batches, and have greater access to those markets. Because some of these markets are so small and they can't afford the products, even though generics are so cheap. Still, it doesn't make economic sense. And we recently acquired the 5th largest generic pharmaceutical company in South Africa, and we were number 6. So we really doubled our size in South Africa. And we've now decided to make additional investments in manufacturing, in building capacity, in creating more employment. But we chose to do it in South Africa and not into some of the neighboring countries, because the skill sets, the capabilities, the ability to do it here, even though slightly more expensive, there is greater stability and more certainty. So as an investor, we chose to remain and continue to do that in South Africa. But if we can get a large marketplace to operate, I think the economies of scale, the cost of production, and the benefit to the customer can be substantially larger.
Now, Malvinder, if I just follow up on this, why then don't you write me a letter? Write a letter and say, here we are, as you say, directly or indirectly in so many countries on the continent, this is what we do. There are these problems about regulations, specifications, and all of that. It would help us as business, but it would also help the health sector in Africa if you people can standardize these things. And you kind of spell it out, just give it to me.
Okay.
Because what I will then do, I will go to NAPAD and say, NAPAD, why don't you deal with this thing? This is the same product, it treats the same illness, but why do you have these millions of rules and regulations which have a negative impact like that? And get the African health ministers to consider this, and I'm quite sure we can solve this problem. That's what I'm trying to talk about. So that we can solve this problem, I'm certain. So that indeed we then have we remove this particular obstacle. That's why it's important to know what it is that you as an investor are saying, because it may very well be that we don't know enough to know even what the problems are.
I think building on that, but shifting the nature of the dialogue and debate a little bit. I think we are focusing a lot on growth. How do we get growth? Is it 6%, 8%, 9%? But I'd like us to talk a little bit more about the nature of the growth. Because if we are just focusing on growth, we can get 10% and still our people will not be happy. The statistics on this continent is that 60% or so of our population is 24 and under. That means that employment issues are paramount. The statistics is also, or the dynamics of what you said, in terms of two other issues. One, how do you engage an emerging middle class and make them have ownership of the development process on the continent or in countries? To come back to what His Excellency President Mbeki is, and not make it sound too large. But how do you also deal with those who, even if we grow at 10%, may never be touched by this growth? I think we need to start breaking it down a bit and looking at the nature of the growth itself. And it might be interesting to just talk about that. In terms of the middle class, that is emerging. How many of our people have a stake in what we're doing? How many of us are focused on trying to develop even a small mortgage market so that people can own their home, even if it's 1 room or 2 rooms? Do we have the institutions, capable of helping people do that so they have a stake in the system? In many countries, we don't. How do we focus on the small and medium enterprises beyond the big guys like yourselves in the business community? The small ones that will create the most jobs for all of our young people who are 24 and below and looking for work. Third, social safety nets. Some of our countries are developing surpluses now. How do we deploy them so that we can tackle those who may not enter into the system or be impacted by the growth? So shifting into the nature of the growth, I think, would be important.
You had a comment in terms of the rural sector, which you said you would come back to later on in the discussion, and how telephony has impacted that.
But maybe that also relates to the point we made, and Ngozi made very brilliantly actually, about how we deal with these issues of dealing with the less fortunate people in our society, where growth is happening, where services are available. In the last year, we have been engaged in a major debate with the donors community, the multilateral institutions, and some of the African telecom ministers as well, about how we're going to deal with extending telephone and telecommunications to the rural areas in Africa. And it was very interesting after we went through the discussion to find actually the main hindrance for this development are the policies of the African government themselves, which is a paradox. To start with, the main hurdle for joining the connected world is the ownership of the device itself. It's quite, in the industry, we had a competition. We managed to get, between the various manufacturers, we managed to get a very cheap mobile at $30 actually, which was won by Motorola, that competition. But when you try to take the mobile in the country, some countries levy 100% tax on the unit. So how can the poor people buy? If you in one breath you say it's very important, and then you tax it, then you're not helping that. The other thing is, in dealing with the industry itself, the government's focused on taxing the mobile companies. Mobile companies made really great success. They made a lot of money. And there would have been a better way, instead of inventing new taxes, because everybody pays the corporate tax, whatever it is. But there is taxes like the air tax, like they invented all kinds of taxes. The finance ministers, people like Ngozi and deliver here. I don't know what you done in your country, but you guys are very inventive. You came with all kind of addition. And you said to them, "What is this?" Said, to be honest, we need some more money.
Yeah, but let's focus not.
But here is the problem. They take the money, and we say, "Look, this is a balloon. Instead of taking the money, why don't you amend my term of license and say it's part of your requirement to invest here and invest there, and to any town or any village more than 500,000 people need to have a telephone." Then that become a condition for me. I have to go and do it. Then I can use any surplus funds I have been doing that, instead of giving it to the government, which doesn't go back to expand telecommunication, go for other reasons. That's why also another thing. The third thing, I tell you something which I should be interested in, because India has been the most offender. You're Minister of Telecom. The government's also invented again something called the Universal Service Fund. What's the Universal Service Fund? They levy percentage of the revenue on the different operators to say we have this money for the rural areas. We audited this last year. We discovered that $6 billion have been collected over the last 2 years. 75% of this money has not been spent as of the last month. So the government took the money, claiming it's going for the rural areas, and it put the money in their pockets. They didn't give it to their own people. I say, what is this? And they took it out from the industry, which is supposed to develop. So this is a number of the issues we're really facing, and we are shooting ourselves in the foot, unfortunately. Sometimes not intentionally, but
I think at least what I was trying to get at as a question was, as I see it, I think telecommunications has played a very significant role in connecting and engaging people and having information moved around, and through connectivity, commerce has moved, and knowledge and information sharing, which has connected people who would have not got connected earlier. And at least in India, if it hadn't been for mobile phones, people used to wait months and months to get a phone line. Today, they don't get a phone line, they get a mobile phone. And in a small village where they grow their crop, they are talking to the people in the markets and deciding which place a truck should go and where they get the best price. I think that has redefined the inclusive growth in India. And I'm sure that's also happening in Africa as well. And I think that's extremely important to ensure when you're talking about the nature of growth. I think the growth needs to be inclusive. And I think what I would, Professor Spence, this issue about increasing growth and decreasing poverty, what are your thoughts in terms of how do we ensure this inclusiveness actually happens?
Will you let me defend Trevor and myself before Michael answers? I just want to say that I thought since Trevor is not, can't speak, I should say we were trying to diminish the incidence of taxes on people like Mo and not the other way around. And in fact, in Nigeria, we gave the telecoms companies 5-year tax holiday, and so that they could have the freedom to bring in, and we allowed them to bring in their equipment and so on for a period of time. I think the only quarrel came when the 5 years would come up, and then they say, can we have another 5? And another 5.
No.
And MTN actually came in, and we thought they took a lot of risk, and we were very happy with it, because when other people would not come in, they came into Nigeria initially, and then later on other competitors came in, and we tried to encourage them. But the point is well taken. I mean, I do agree that there is a lot of red tape, there is a lot of burden on the businesses. There's no doubt about that.
Ngozi have been the most enlightened, well, you and Trevor have been the most, really, in fairness, enlightened finance minister. I mentioned you as a representative of your colleagues, but you two guys have been really great. It's not a personal issue.
I think let's carry on the debate.
There are other finance ministers.
Definitely one other finance ministers should have been here.
I think if you make profits, you should get taxed. So that's good. But
we're paying the tax. I'm not complaining about that.
Let's move ahead. Let's just focus on this issue, on the nature of growth, and then let's get the public engaged in questions and answers. After that, we'll get to the audience.
Well, I'm going to try to lay out why this is really hard. Many African countries have natural resources. There is a demand shock in the world that is not going to go away because of the growth of China and India. That's 40% of the world's population. That will drive prices, and it will drive growth, and it will not drive inclusive growth. They are not industries that employ enough people, and it doesn't solve Ngozi's problem. And the really hard problem in terms of leadership and economic management is to turn that wealth intertemporally into a set of environmental conditions, infrastructure, market opportunities, government regulation that generate a much broader pattern of investment to serve the domestic and global economies. Now, let me make one other statement that may strike people as too strong. There is no high growth measure at 7% or above, sustained high growth example, that does not sell large amounts to the global economy, particularly in the early stages. Now, it may be that we can invent a model here, that is an exception to that principle, but I doubt it. And the reason that's true is domestic demand isn't big enough in the early stages of growth to generate enough demand to drive the growth. And so And then that changes over time. So a country like South Africa is different from India. Now has a large domestic market. China has a very interesting domestic market that'll drive a lot of demand. In fact, most of the argument about global imbalances is about getting China to use the domestic demand to drive the economy so we can not rely so heavily on American consumption. So my response to Ngozi would say a part of this very encouraging discussion that at least I've heard here has to be focused on expanding the range of employment and focusing on what it is that it takes to create a ton of incremental employment. You can't solve the inclusiveness problem without doing that. India is opening up its markets precisely because if it relied on IT and business process outsourcing, the middle class, the emerging middle class would be fine, and the 70% of people in agriculture wouldn't. They'd be out of the game. That's why they changed. And India is serious, and all of you are serious about the inclusive growth. Now, I don't think there's a formula for doing this, so this isn't meant to be, once you get it, everybody knows how to do it. But it's for sure important to head off in that direction. And then I think, once you've got that piece straight, and I'll stop here, then one thinks about dealing fairly with the people who don't make it into the kind of growth process in the early stages of it, because it can't happen overnight. We're talking, as I mentioned at the start, about multi-decade processes. And so ironclad delivery of services, education, healthcare, and so on, is an important part of the inclusiveness part of the growth process. Sorry for this.
Thank you. Let's open the floor for questions.
Thank you.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's important to, my name is Oba Otudeko from Nigeria. I think it's very important to accentuate areas of successes that we have made in Africa, especially the leadership that we are having, the current leadership that we are having on the political front. Their commitment to what I believe has been proven to be the surest way of securing development anywhere in the world. Self-help is best help. I have the experience of telecoms in Nigeria, and we are a product really of neglect, in the sense that the MTN of South Africa had this outstanding success because the licensing round in Nigeria came up at a time when the telecoms market had this big shock that the West didn't want to touch it, and that provided opportunity for the MTNs of this world. But the MTNs of this world succeeded because they had institutional support from South Africa. Your Excellency, you know very much what you did at that time. We also have an experience in Nigeria of banking consolidation and what that has brought for the financial services industry. In West Africa, my Ghanaian friend knows what Nigerian banks have managed to do, and this is where experience really counts. From what His Excellency was saying, I believe his disaggregation thesis can be translated to optimum size in terms of business, because there's an optimum size for management that produces efficiency, which is more or less what you are saying using the political term. The reality of it is that if the regions, are centers of excellence, if within centers of excellence, areas of strength are identified where we have comparative advantage as a continent, take minerals, take various resources, if governments take the leadership of giving support, for example, this initiative of the Africa Infrastructure Fund that is being founded by South Africa. We also have the AFC. And I don't see a clash here, because cynics might see it as a clash and competition. But if one can focus on SADC and the other can focus on the West Africa region, and if the East can be assisted by way of funds transfer across, the regions, what is very important as a factor of production where Africans have problem, finance, will have been addressed. Because the truth is that access, if we want to be sincere to ourselves, I remember in those days, most deals were really structured in the clubs, in the country clubs in the evening, by the white people at that time. And they just decided, and that's it. In the morning, they gave us instruction. I was a bank clerk, and they will give us instruction. The deal has been struck. It's the same everywhere. People talk the same language to themselves. So if decision making in the financial services industry, supported with the reserves of our banks, can, be put in the hands of people who are nearer to where, the shoe pinches. I mean,
so do you have a question, or is it a comment?
Then, what I'm trying to say, by way of, I am saying, because His Excellency was asking for advice, I am saying that in particular areas where help is required, where Africans cannot access help easily, for instance, finance, for instance, technology, for instance, space, areas like that, Africans can be supported through their initiatives being nurtured by government support. That is all I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, okay, no worries. Just give me a signal.
The lady right here.
I'm Rosa Whitaker, and I want to applaud all the panelists. It's been a great session. I'd like to hear more about the strategies for Africa adding value to its primary exports, because we know that no country in the world has transitioned from poverty exporting primary and raw materials. And as long as Africa remains an exporter of primary and raw materials, I don't think we will ever transition out of poverty or see the potential. Now, I have a company that facilitates trade and investment, and one of the biggest challenges that we see is precisely what President Mbeki talked about, the ability of the government to solve the problems of businesses. We've seen some excellent opportunities that have been lost because the governments, the bureaucracies cannot solve very specific problems. For example, we find in a lot of governments the incentive structures. The incentive for exporting, for example, raw cocoa beans in Ghana was the same as the incentive for exporting processed cocoa. Now, when the government saw that and they changed the incentive structure and they dealt with some other issues, they got a major investment from the agricultural companies and processed cocoa. I don't think we're ever going to see the jobs, and we'll never see the income unless we can really refine some strategies to add value to the primary exports and also increase the capacity of the bureaucracies to address the specific bottlenecks that businesses have.
Would you want to answer that question about the exports?
Yes. Well, I agree with Rosa. I really do, but there's also another side of it. But on our own side, I think we've had a compendium, lists now done by ourselves, by the World Economic Forum, by the IFC, of each country. What are the specific things that we need to do, country by country, to lift these bureaucratic impediments, and change our regimes, make it easier for business. So I really, again, want to come back. I do agree with His Excellency that internally we also each need to sit down and tackle this. And unless and until we do, we'll continue to have this cloud. We each need to sit down. We have a list, even for my own country. What's the next step of things we need to lift? So I agree with that. But second, when we start to do that, Rosa, you would also agree that externally, the developed countries also have to look at the tariffs they have for our processed products. it is also anomalous that when we add value to our products, their tariffs escalate and make it much more expensive. So I think we need you also as a voice, and all the people who are here to say, we've been debating these things, so let's do it internally. That's the first piece of homework. Because if we don't, they'll continue pointing fingers at us and saying you have 15 and 50 regulations you've not dealt with. But once we do, they need to lift their tariffs so that our processed goods can also be sold outside.
Sorry, I thought I was about to say something before Maria Ramos. Oh, my name is Ruel Koza. I'm chairman of the NEPAD Business Foundation. I just wanted to say something by way of augmenting on the concept broached by His Excellency the President, President Mbeki, the concept of disaggregation. It's a very, very useful concept that I believe we need to use very pragmatically. What I would like to add is that as we disaggregate, in a bid to deal with the huge whale that is a whale of a problem that is Africa, we also need to understand that disaggregation is part of reiterative process. As we disaggregate, we shall need to aggregate almost simultaneously. As we dismember, we will also need to configure. As we operate, we need to cooperate as the continent. And we need to do all of that expeditiously. Because let's face it, India is not a monolith. In fact, they are so big, they are in fact more of a continent than Africa. China is not monolithic either. But when they come to trade with us, they come as an elephantine configuration. So there is a sense in which we have to disaggregate in a bid to deal pragmatically with the problem, but at the same time we need to find ways of cooperating and pooling resources. Otherwise we're going to wind up operating as a continent in fragments. And if you operate as a continent in fragments, opportunities for exploitation in this globalization era are magnified. So I would like to urge that we pool resources. Let ECOWAS, let the East African community, let ourselves down in the South come together and say, where this is concerned, we shall work together right now, not 5 years from now, not in 10 years, because it might just be too late.
Thank you. Let's
cooperate and operate as we move along and do it expeditiously.
Maria Ramos, and to the panelists and Mr. President, when we were in Davos earlier on this year, I don't think you could go to any session without the topic of debate being about climate change. And we've met for 2.5 days in Cape Town, and we've scarcely spoken about climate change, yet we sit on a continent where we have enormous opportunities, and yet we'll face also enormous challenges around issues of climate change. And I say we have enormous opportunities because we, perhaps not in South Africa where our levels of emissions are relatively high compared to many other countries on the continent, but on our continent we have very low levels of emission. We sit on an enormous amount of wealth in terms of biodiversity, and so we have tremendous opportunities. And the world out there is developing all kinds of interesting things, such as carbon credits, and yet we remain very distant from that particular debate. We talk about the richness of our continent in terms of natural resources, yet we sit on an enormous amount of wealth in terms of natural resources when we think about carbon credits and the potential trade in that. We need to begin to engage in that and think not just in terms of natural resources, but in terms of the contribution and the wealth that we have in relation to that, and how we engage globally in terms of the issues around climate change. We also need to do that early, because if all of the science is correct around the issues of climate change, as a continent, we are, and many countries on this continent, and again, this is about blueprints and not one blueprint for the continent, many countries are going to face different challenges around climate change in our continent, but we are going to face challenges, and we need to access the resources out there in relation to dealing with those challenges earlier rather than later. This is not new. It is, in fact, as you reminded me once, Mr. President, it was one of the early discussions in the formulation of the NEPAD discussion document and the founding document. And so I want to urge that as we begin and as we take these discussions forward in fora like this, like the World Economic Forum, we stop thinking just about natural resources, but we also start thinking about climate and the opportunities on our continent in relation to that, and think about that as an opportunity and as part of our wealth on this continent of ours. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, you can see where we...
Soulmates.
Yeah. we are getting very good comments from the audience. I couldn't agree more. I think somehow we are missing. Even in Davos, when the climate change discussion was going on, I recall standing up and saying, hey, nobody has mentioned Africa in this debate. Somehow, 10 years from now, everybody will suddenly discover Africa in the climate change debate. And then we'll start getting charity of people trying to draw us in. But actually, there's tremendous opportunity, as Maria just said. And the issue for us is, how do we get some of these enormous resources that are now going to go into dealing with this issue of climate change invested here on the continent? Because it could be a win-win where some of the investments to serve as carbon sinks, if we get people, for instance, planting forests, doing other things that, contribute to making carbon sinks, those could create employment here, trading carbon credits. We've not even begun to engage in it, and yet there are companies out there who would like to see what opportunities exist here in Africa, for that. So I think we should all have a session organized. I don't know whether it's next year, this year, but before then I would hope that our business communities in their meetings would also begin to talk about this and begin to take advantage. If we don't do it, the consequences for us are twofold. We lose. We lose the investments that could come here, and we lose in terms of people realizing what impact the climate change has on us. If we act early, Maria is completely right.
So I think certainly, I guess that's a debate that must get actively deliberated upon, and I'm sure in January next year.
But Malvinder, let's say about this. The countries in the Congo Basin, the Congos, Gabon and all that, have in fact got together already to deal with this particular question. So there is some structure there. And indeed we began a discussion with them, certainly the heads of state, about the matters that Maria is raising. So there's some process that's gone on. At this last meeting that we had now in Germany with the G8, the specific matter that Maria is raising was raised in the Africa G8 interaction, also arises out of a UN conference that was held in Nairobi last year, when the same matter was raised. So it's come up there. So in fact, it has been added, including this issue of carbon credits and so on. It's been added to the joint Africa G8 program, this particular matter. But I'm saying already the countries in the Congo River Basin had actually got together to deal with this. And indeed, very important one of the issues, an issue that was raised, I was in another meeting this morning with President Kabila, and they were saying that 40% of the 40 million of the Congolese population of 60 million depend directly or indirectly on forestry products for their living, for fuel, and so on. And the problem, of course, is that once you address this matter correctly that Maria raises, simultaneously you've got to address the question of how their livelihoods. To save the forests, you need to generate different kind of economic activity so that you then don't get the destruction of this forest, which means you also need to engage or deal with, or whatever is the correct phrase, with the logging companies. So there is a process, I'm saying, Malvinder, that's going on. It's at the beginning, but to deal with the matter that Maria is raising.
Yes, among the number of issues which we have not raised or discussed today, actually, also the issue of good governance. I think that's an important issue for us, really, in Africa. And the failure in Africa over the last 50 years, actually, in my view at least, was failure in governance. We had our independence over 50 years ago. What have we done with it? Most of us actually are worse off now than when we were under the colonial system. This is a fact. As an Africans, we must accept and must deal with it. And for that reason, actually, we really need to focus on the government. I want to say a word about an initiative we are doing, which is to produce an index of governance for all of the African countries. This is not by choice. Countries sign up to say, I'll do it. No. We're doing it together with the World Bank, United Nations, etc., and we're giving the information to the civil society. We need exactly to measure 6 indicators. What's good governance? What are the priorities of the leaders? What are the deliverables to the people? And this is an initiative we're moving forward with. It's an African foundation, and it is African people running it, and we don't take money from anybody. And at the end, we hope that every year we find a wonderful president or leader who managed to take his country out of poverty and move his index. And then there's a committee of African people again, headed by Kofi Annan, and Ngozi actually is one of his members there, who will decide a winner. And like you won Nobel Prize in recognition of your excellence, we want also to recognize our successful presidents if they take us forward. But what we need is a debate. We need a debate in Africa about governance. What those guys are doing to us. We need to know exactly what they're delivering to us. And we need that open, transparent, and we give the data to all the African people. So this is an initiative here we are doing, and we're glad we have the support of President Mbeki and the advice from various African leaders in various areas. So there is something we're trying to do as an African, and that's important that we are seen also doing something and critical to our progress, I believe. That's what I want to mention.
But Mo, sorry, Mo, you can't say that. You can't say for some of us it was better to be colonized.
I didn't say that.
You didn't?
No, I say why we went downhill. Why, if you look at the standard of living, when Ghana became independent 50 years ago, Mr. President, do you know the income per head was higher than Thailand, than Taiwan, than Malaysia, when it became independent?
Sure.
Then here's the question.
So long as you didn't say
are
that,
we
so
going
long as I
downhill
misheard
or where are
you.
we going?
So long as I misheard you, I heard you to say this.
Yeah, that's what I
to
meant.
tell the truth, it was for some of us it was better to live under colonial conditions. You didn't?
No.
Okay, no, that's fine. No, that's okay. No, that's all right. But so sorry,
But is
Malvinder.
it acceptable to you that our economic situation now, our standard of living now in Africa is going down in real terms after 50 years? Is that acceptable?
Sure, no, of course not. Oh, of course not. But you see, part of what was said, we shouldn't get down that route. Part of what was said at the beginning of this was quite correct. The higher levels of optimism, the higher rates of growth, is it sustainable, and all of that, very legitimate. But it's a positive thing. Of course, it's not. It can't be acceptable that you get this continuous process of impoverishment.
We need to stop it, and we need to be critical of ourselves. And it's our fault.
Yeah, and I was then going to
repair
say,
it.
you see, I was then going to say more about the governance issue. You see, maybe we need it. But again, I think we've got to be a bit more focused. You see, take the NAPAD peer review system that I was talking about. Dealing with this matter, very detailed work that is being done on countries, political governance, economic governance, corporate governance, all elements of all of those. And I wish maybe next month I'll give you the NAPAD peer review report on South Africa.
Wonderful.
Or give you an earlier one on Ghana, which will tell you about the governance challenges, not just political, management of the economy, corporate governance, society generally. And this work is being done, and actually what you see that's coming out, it's the point that you had made yourself earlier. It's quite unhealthy to make global challenges, global statements, as though everything is equal. To see Africa, because as you said, some of the people in Europe would say Africa, they read Darfur and Zimbabwe. Or read misgovernance, because it's not true. In real, actual, practical terms, and where you had problems, you can see, we take Nigeria, the chief of finance, economic crimes, and so on, Ribadu, we came here to interact with his counterparts in South Africa to say, look, all of us have got to deal with this management of corruption, theft of public funds, movement of this money across boundaries. What is it that we can do together? These are things that are happening, are being done. So I'm saying that rather than say let's have a general discussion on the governance question, perhaps what we should say, why don't we indeed give a report about what's happening with the governance thing on the African continent? Then after that, they can say what it is that we still need to discuss. Because in reality, I think that in many parts of the continent, in many countries, there are lots and lots of positive things that are being done. And there's other interventions at the African Union, NAPAD level, also trying to do this. So we shouldn't, I think, convey a kind of message of a global disaster on the continent. I don't understand.
I totally agree that we need to focus on what is going right on the continent. And I feel so optimistic as I look at it. People sometimes say naively so, but I actually saw this, the index that was being developed as an exciting exercise coming from us or from people within the continent, even if you pull in others to help. Because so often we have others developing indices to measure us. We also have to start being part and parcel of developing the methodologies that measure what we do. Every time I look around, somebody has developed some index to measure what Africans are doing, in this way, and we've never had a say. Be it a World Bank index, an IFC index, a World Economic Forum index, where are Africa's indices? For whatever reason. So I think it's a bit exciting that an African thought, why don't we try to think ourselves? We can get others to help us. How do we conceptualize this issue and put our index together? And I think that generating a conversation around it, that shows we are doing some things right. I think that thing will point out that certain things are going the right way, others maybe not so. That would be a very exciting thing to look at.
And the value of the index really, it generates a debate. We want the civil society here to have a debate about governance. What exactly is happening? We need to have that debate, and we need to have the measure, the yardstick. We measure everything. Why not governance? That is important to be measured and given to the civil society so that they exactly value what is going on there.
I think we've had an extremely engaging dialogue and debate and a lot of participation from the audience. I think it's time we should conclude this, and I'd just like to...
Desperate hand behind you there.
I've got 15 hands actually raised, so I'd like to close this at this point and say clearly I think there are a lot of interesting and very relevant points that came up here in terms of the regional cooperation, in terms of really breaking up a series of the issues rather than just focusing on Africa as one solution, the whole focus on public-private partnerships, in terms of the nature of growth and how do we find that right model and not having any one answer, but really as we evolve and go through, try and find the right way and really go through the learning process. And then this issue of governance and climate change, and I'm sure there'll be many more points that got debated and discussed over the last 2.5 days. And then, Mr. President, as you said, the whole issue of blueprints and not one single blueprint. I think with that, I'd like to close this session. And I, for one, certainly having spent 2.5 days here, have learned a great deal from the various sessions and the various interactions that I've had. And I can say that having been in business in Africa since 1978, I feel extremely confident that this continent has a great future, great people, a lot of capabilities, and I'm sure it will drive the global agenda and engulf the world to work along with everybody in Africa. Before I hand over the mic to Haiko to give the vote of thanks, I'd like to personally thank all the panelists here who've really been very frank, very open, and extremely engaged in a great dialogue. So please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you, Malvinder. I'm tempted to stand up because it's a real hot seat when you're sitting here. I'm privileged to be part of this round. I don't feel like I belong here, so I'm tempted to stand up. I think my staff put me here to get me to sit down for 2 hours, which has been a pleasure. It's a privilege to watch this kind of interaction. It's a privilege to facilitate a summit of this nature. The points about differentiation, about disaggregation, about focus, about setting the scene, breaking it down to get to the level of what His Excellency said about how do we do it, where do we do it, are points that are extremely well taken. I was extremely pleased yesterday that some of our CEOs, some African CEOs, ambushed my boss, Klaus, with those kind of messages to say the story of a new narrative or a changing African narrative should be on the Davos agenda, and I might add, should probably be on our China agenda, on our Latin America agenda as well. It's not just a north-south axis, Davos feeding into Cape Town, vice versa. That was pretty neatly done, Maria and others, and I think it is on the agenda. I can commit to that. I was asked this morning at 6:20 by the SABC, mission accomplished. And I was tempted to say yes because the meeting was almost over, but then I was reminded that someone else said that on an aircraft carrier a while ago, and which was, and he's still in trouble for that. Clearly the work starts now, and the challenges remain. And I think the commitment of people that take 3 days, close on 3 days, and some even 4 out of their busy schedules means that they're committed to this effort. They engaged. The spirit that you've seen here, but the spirit that you've seen in other meetings bears allegiance to that we hear because we committed and that we want to do something about this. It's not my job to wrap up the meeting because it's impossible of 47 sessions. Some highlights that stand out, maybe Maria missed them, but there was an unprecedented focus on climate change. Clearly the work starts here to take forward or to develop an African response and to maximize the potential opportunities as well as, of course, negate or mitigate the risks. And I challenge people like Maria, but also the Pat Davieses of Sasol and other companies that we know are passionate about this, to work with us or with other partners to do something in the run-up to Davos and actually to develop possibly a business-led response to that. Another highlight for me was the discussion, or the series of discussions on growth, and it was fantastic to have Professor Michael Spence, but also Ngozi, Minister Manuel, and others to drive that. Mr. President, I find Mo's proposal on measuring governance and incentivizing governance thoroughly compelling. I went to his launch in London. Former President Robinson. Yeah. He didn't pay me to say that, brother. So again, that energized this meeting because it's controversial, it's interesting, and I wish him well. The participation of Chinese and Indian leaders in this meeting, really typified by Malvinder, has energized and has brought the discussion about the impact of China and India on Africa to a completely different level. I've heard almost throughout the meeting positive comment about having obviously the benefit of not speaking about China and India without them in the room, as opposed to speaking to and with Chinese and Indian leaders. And I thank our Chinese participation and Malvinder and the Minister for making the long way. Clearly that's again an ongoing relationship, one where we as Africans need to develop responses and engage on a different level. Lastly, maybe agriculture. Again, we were proud to have been able to set a stage in this room for a deliberate attempt to emulate other continents or subcontinents in leapfrogging, reaching a very ambitious goal of an African Green Revolution led by Kofi Annan. A couple of thank yous. Of course, Mr. President, thanks to you and your colleagues, the South African authorities, for the warm hospitality. We know that we certainly don't take that for granted. Our partners who make this meeting possible financially, our members who drive the agenda, who set the agenda, and I'd like to suggest that certainly crank that up, but I also want to see that there is delivery on your wishes. We met in Davos earlier this year, and some of the messaging: diversify your panels in terms of get away from South Africans, get women onto panels, etc. We are listening. We're maybe not getting it right in terms of focus. Less is more. We go more is less. It's difficult to focus when you have a constituency as broad and as interested and as engaged as ours. Of course, a special word of thank you to the co-chairs. We've done a fantastic job. Again, an unusually diverse group of people. In fact, in the first briefing that we had, they almost picked a fight with each other, which was a great sign and set the stage for the summit. I want to thank my colleagues, the blue badges that you see at the back of the room. They've done a great job. Another feature of the summit is the help that we get from the city service leaders, as they're called. These are youngsters that give a year of their time to public service. And again, you energize us, you rejuvenate, and it's fantastic to have you guys with us. Before I introduce or welcome you to join us for the closing lunch, and ask those of you that are interested to stay behind to watch the rest of the film. That was an excerpt of Carol's film. We'll show the full 55-minute film, and I welcome Carol in the room on these screens right now. There she is. Great movie, by the way. Mr. President, this hasn't all been all work and no play. We've had some fantastic light moments. I'll share some of them with you. We've had a focus on African fashion and design, really as a symbolism and symbolic of the new spirit, this new narrative.
And Ngozi's birthday.
And Ngozi's birthday we celebrated as well, that's right. She's 21, we sent her 21 rows.
Thank you.
But we had a fashion dinner, Mr. President, and for that we invested in we went to some street artists and we made some mannequins which we wanted to dress with the latest African fashion. The problem was that we didn't quite get the specs right, that the fashion wasn't quite designed for a size 0, so those were not used. I was asked when we arrived how we planned to deal with possible disruptions by the strike, and of course made a very positive statement that we're in good hands and we'll be fine. not having figured that Pop Crew was having its annual Congress inside the convention center. So, again, I think that's indicative of a mature democracy that can happen. And I'm relieved that nothing happened, but it tells an incredible story about the maturity and the dynamism and that this is a stable democracy. All that remains for me is to thank participants. Without you, without your engagement, without you engaging in the spirit of dialogue, in this action-oriented spirit of dialogue, and actually rolling up your sleeves. I thought at one stage the president was going to punch Mo. It looked like you were. I think that's the spirit that we. Yeah. That's the spirit that we need. And again, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. We'll certainly keep you informed of our next initiatives, and we hope to see you there.